Where am I? Oh yeah, the Godzilla timeline. So today we're going to cover the Godzilla timeline. Or rather, timelines. Yeah, as with most long-running series, they have multiple different continuities. Godzilla is no different, featuring several throughout its 70-year history, so let's go through the basic ones. Today we're going to explain the order of events per timeline, and we're going to start with the Showa era. Pretty simple, it goes Godzilla, Godzilla raids again, Rodan, Varan, Mothra, King Kong vs. Godzilla, Atragon, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Ghidorah the three-headed monster, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, Invasion of Astro Monster, War of the Gargantuas, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, Son of Godzilla, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, Godzilla vs. Gigan, Godzilla vs. Megalon, Zone Fighter, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, Terror of Mechagodzilla, and Destroy All Monsters. All Monsters Attack is not included in the list as it is set in reality. Whatever reality is. Also, Destroy All Monsters is put at the end of the timeline because it is set at the end of the 20th century, or 1999, creating about 5-year gap between 1967 and 1971, where Godzilla just disappeared from the world. It is possible that other events occurred, but I like to think that Godzilla would just remained in hibernation on Solgale Island that whole time. Or possibly, Godzilla died there and the one we see in Godzilla vs. Hedorah is actually Minya grown up. Interesting little fan theory, but we'll delve more into those in another episode. The Zone Fighter is included on this list as it features Godzilla Monsters, Godzilla King Ghidorah, and Gigan. Gigan even canonically dies in Zone Fighter, so it definitely counts. This timeline ends with Godzilla and all the Earth monsters defeating King Ghidorah and living in peace on Monsterland. This series encapsulates the rise, the fall, and the rebirth of the kaiju movie into more kid-focused stories that are still relevant even to this day. Following up that era will be tricky as the 1970s featured the whimpering out of the Godzilla series, from lowering box office sales to general disinterest from audiences and seemingly Toho. Godzilla entered its first wilderness era, where nothing concrete ever seemed to happen and projects would come and go like tides on a beach. But that would all change in the mid-1980s with the Heisei era. The Heisei era simply goes Godzilla, the Mysterians, asterisk, the return of Godzilla, Godzilla vs. Biollante, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, Godzilla vs. Mothra, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, Godzilla vs. Destroyer, Godzilla vs. Gigan Rex, and Godzilla vs. Megalon. I now understand why the Japanese call this the Versus series. This timeline is interesting as it probably has the most consistent continuity of any of the eras. Each movie has at least one thing that connects it to a previous one in some way. This timeline also has a confirmed 3 different Godzillas, possibly 4, depending on what you think about Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. The Mysterians is included on this list with an asterisk because in one source book for Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, it is stated that Mogra, the giant mech designed in the film to fight Godzilla and Space Godzilla eventually, was designed off of the models that were used by the Mysterians in their invasion in 1957. That one is just up in the air if that's actually canon or if that's just sort of a weird thing in one book. Up to you. This timeline ends with the death of Godzilla 2 and the rebirth of Godzilla 3, who then proceeds to disappear for about 25 years before reappearing in Godzilla vs. Gigan Rex to counter the Gigan invasion of roughly 2022, and then Megalon's attack in 2023, and quite possibly another short later on in this year. Now, Godzilla had disappeared from Japan and was going overseas for an
all-new American version Godzilla.
Oh wait, no, that didn't happen. But then it actually did with the TriStar Godzilla. And this timeline goes Godzilla and Godzilla the series. The movie was planned to have sequels, but due to reasons, it never happened. But something tells me this isn't the last time we're going to see this movie in this video. No, seriously, it's back over there, just take a look. Toho, seeing the reception of the '98 American film, decided to get another production right off the ground. And within 18 months of the release of the 1998 film, Godzilla 2000 Millennium came out and officially kicked off the Millennium Era. Personally, I put the '98 film in the beginning of the Millennium Era, but that's just me. Godzilla 2000 Millennium's timeline goes as simple: Godzilla, Godzilla 2000 Millennium, another really short reboot movie pretty much, ignoring all the other ones in between. Following that is Godzilla x Megaguirus, the G-Annihilation strategy, which its timeline goes Godzilla, alternate timeline version where Godzilla never dies, and Godzilla x Megaguirus, the G-Annihilation strategy. That's it. Pretty simple, just an alternate timeline for the 1954 film. Now we move on to the fantastic Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. The timeline simply goes Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. It's a long title, but one of the best films and a really short continuity.
The New York attack was Godzilla, right? That's what all the American experts claim, but our guys here have doubts.
Yeah, we need to acknowledge that, don't we? You remember how I said earlier that the 98 movie would come back in some capacity? This is it. I don't fully get it, because in the 1998 movie, the events of the 1954 film definitely did not happen, because no one knows what Godzilla is. There are multiple scenes in the movie where they're trying to figure out what it is, and one person calls the monster Godzilla. Maybe it's like an alternate timeline of the movie where all the characters were like, oh, it's like that giant lizard that attacked Tokyo in the 60s. And then Matthew Broderick goes, no, it's nothing like Gojira, which attacked Tokyo in 1954. And I should know, I study worms. Should this be taken seriously, or is this just a throwaway line? That's up to you. But I'm going to put it in the timeline because I think it's funny. After that, we get the Kiryu Saga, which goes Godzilla, Rodan, Mothra, Atragon, Dogura, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, War of the Gargantuas, King Kong Escapes, Space Amoeba, Goroth, Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, and Godzilla Tokyo SOS. Most of the movies are the other Toho monster films from the 1960s, set in an alternate time where Godzilla was the kind of the harbinger of doom for Japan. Goroth is a little bit questionable. The official timeline just specifies that Moguma shows up, who is in Goroth, but in Goroth the moon is destroyed and the moon is perfectly fine in Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. Maybe it's a mechanical moon, or it's another space egg like that one episode of Doctor Who. And finally, to wrap up the Millennium Era, we have Godzilla Final Wars, which is set in no timeline. It stands alone completely. Personally, I like to think it's the end of all Godzilla timelines, much like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But after lowering box office sales for the Godzilla movies and the flop of Godzilla Final Wars, Godzilla entered its second wilderness era. During this time, there were just a couple false starts, most notably a Yoshimitsu Banno directed Godzilla IMAX film that never got off the ground, and a cameo of Godzilla in the opening scene of Always, Sunset on 3rd Street 2, directed by later Godzilla director Takashi Yamazaki. That was until 2014, when Godzilla came back, this time the second American version, with Gareth Edwards' Godzilla and the Monsterverse. The Monsterverse timeline simply goes Kong Skull Island, the Netflix Skull Island, Godzilla, Monarch, Legacy of Monsters, Godzilla King of the Monsters, Godzilla vs. Kong, and Godzilla Kong the New Empire. I put Monarch Legacy of Monsters a year after Godzilla, as most of it is set in 2015. However, the show does jump back before Kong Skull Island to show the creation and foundation of Monarch as an organization. Following up the Monsterverse is the Shin timeline, which goes Shin Godzilla. The anime trilogy is a, trilogy of movies on Netflix, set mostly in the far future, and it features humanity's efforts to retake Earth from Godzilla. The timeline goes Godzilla, Planet of the Monsters, Godzilla, City on the Edge of Battle, and Godzilla, the Planet Eater. We also have the Singular Point timeline, which goes Godzilla Singular Point. That's it. And finally, the -1 timeline, which is just Godzilla -1, another completely standalone film. That's the basic timeline of the Godzilla series. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time once I figure out where exactly I am and how to get out of here and get back to where I was.